Close your eyes and take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to another episode of Z in History. Fairy tales always tell us that kings and queens fall in love and live happily ever after. But real history is rarely that simple. When powerful people fall in love, they do not just risk their own hearts. They risk their entire countries. Tonight, we are looking at the most famous romance of the ancient world. We will follow a strict Roman general who held the world in his hands, and the brilliant Egyptian queen who made him throw it all away. It is a story of an exhausted man bound by strict laws, a golden ship, and a choice to finally find peace. Let's step back in time. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Armor. The year was 41 BC, and Mark Antony stood in the ankle-deep mud of a military camp. Although the rain had finally stopped, the ground was completely ruined. With every step he took, his leather boots sank deep into the wet earth, the heavy suction pulling at his heels. His iron armor dug sharply into his shoulders, feeling colder and heavier than usual as he ran a rough, calloused hand over his face to wipe away a layer of grime. As a Roman general, his entire life was defined by dirt, strict discipline, and endless war. He commanded thousands of men, lived in canvas tents, and survived on dried rations. Back in Rome, there was a strict social rule called dignitas, which dictated that a good Roman man was essentially a machine built for the state. He was not allowed to care about luxury, he was not allowed to feel fear, and he was certainly never allowed to put love above his duty. Antony was completely exhausted by it all. Having spent his entire life pretending to be a perfect, emotionless statue, he enforced the rules and punished men who showed weakness. Even though he was the most powerful man in the East, he felt totally empty inside. The military victories brought him no joy, and the immense power brought him no peace. He had summoned the Queen of Egypt to his camp because he needed to know if she was loyal to Rome, expecting a boring, routine meeting. He assumed she would arrive on a modest boat, kneel in the mud, and beg for his protection just like every other conquered ruler. Standing near the river, he waited for her to arrive, completely unaware of how desperately he wanted someone to finally break through his armor so he could stop pretending. Chapter 2. The Scent on the Wind. When word finally reached the camp that the Queen of Egypt had arrived, Antony walked down to the edge of the churning brown river. His soldiers lined the banks with their spears held straight, while Antony stood tall and pushed his chest out, fully prepared to act like a stern Roman judge. On the water, Cleopatra watched the muddy camp approach. She did not feel like a goddess, but rather felt the crushing weight of an entire fragile empire resting on her shoulders. Her country was incredibly rich, but her military was weak enough that Rome could crush Egypt in a single day. Viewing Antony as a dangerous weapon, she knew she had to disarm him to save her people. Using psychology rather than swords, she certainly did not arrive quietly. Sailing slowly up the river on a massive ship, the back of her vessel was plated entirely in shining gold that blinded the Roman soldiers on the shore. The massive sails were dyed a rich purple, a color so expensive that it represented absolute royalty, while silver oars hit the water in perfect time to a hypnotic rhythm played by flutes on the deck. But the visual shock was not her most powerful weapon. It was the scent. Having soaked those purple sails in expensive jasmine perfume, She let the warm summer wind carry the sweet, intoxicating smell directly over the muddy Roman camp, cutting right through the stench of sweat and horses. As Antony breathed it in, a massive wave of relief washed over him. The heavy scent clouded his rigid mind, causing his shoulders to drop as the strict Roman world began to slip away. When the ship finally dropped its anchor, she did not step down into the mud, but instead sent a messenger to the shore, actively inviting the most powerful general in Rome to leave his territory and row out to her. Chapter 3: The Pearl and the Smile. Accepting the surprising invitation, Antony stepped onto the golden ship that evening. The wooden deck had completely vanished under a soft, thick carpet of fresh rose petals that crushed gently beneath his heavy boots. The smell of sweet incense filled the warm night air as he walked into the gently lit cabin, and then he finally saw her, lounging gracefully on a couch. Cleopatra did not wear heavy armor or carry weapons. Instead, she wore sheer linen that clung perfectly to her curves, looking up at him with dark, knowing eyes and a quiet smile. The physical pull was immediate, and Antony felt his heart slam against his ribs. Sitting close together at a feast where the table groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fresh fruit, she studied him carefully. She saw past the fierce general to the tired, broken man hiding underneath the armor. Realizing that she didn't just want to manipulate him, she found his rough edges genuinely fascinating, playfully mocking his strict Roman ways. She laughed at his seriousness before making a bold bet. She claimed she could spend a massive fortune on a single meal, and Antony took the bet immediately, thinking she was joking since he knew the exact cost of supplying an army. Cleopatra just smiled and called for a cup of vinegar. Unclipping a flawless pearl earring worth enough to feed an entire legion, she dropped the jewel directly into the acid, watching it bubble and dissolve into a cloudy liquid. Keeping her eyes locked deeply on his, she picked up the cup, drank the liquid, and won the bet. By winning his absolute attention, she made Antony realize that he finally didn't have to pretend to be a stone statue anymore. He felt truly alive. Chapter 4: Dropping the Sword. Even after the official meeting ended and the political treaties were signed, Antony could not bring himself to leave her. Roman law demanded that he return to the capital. His soldiers expected him to march back to Italy, and he had a massive reputation to uphold. Instead of doing his duty, he made a shocking choice, abandoning his loyal men in the dirt and ordering his generals to handle the borders. He boarded a ship and followed her straight into the intense heat of Egypt, leaving his rigid life behind. He stepped off the boat in Alexandria into the blinding sun and warm air. Walking into her palace, he took off his heavy iron armor, letting it hit the stone floor with a loud clang. He stopped wearing the scratchy Roman wool in favor of a simple tunic, relishing the feeling of soft Egyptian silk against his bare skin for the first time. Cleopatra felt safe enough to drop her own guard, stopping her act as a flawless queen while he stopped acting like a ruthless general. They simply became two normal people, spending the entire winter hidden away in her palace. They shared long mornings tangled in soft linen sheets and whispered secrets in the dark. He traced the soft lines of her face while she traced the harsh battle scars on his chest, becoming completely addicted to her touch. Wandering the dark streets of the city at night, they played practical jokes on merchants and laughed until their stomachs hurt. Surrendering completely to his feelings, the fierce warrior finally found true peace and felt human. Chapter 5: The Cold Roman Bed. The real world eventually crashed back into their paradise when messengers arrived from Italy. Politics forced Antony to leave her warm arms because a crisis had broken out in Rome, and his political allies were rapidly losing power. Packing his bags, he had no choice but to sail back to the rigid rules of his homeland, arriving in a city where the sky was grey and the air was freezing. He put his heavy iron armor back on, feeling that the metal was somehow heavier than before. To stop a civil war, his rival demanded a treaty, forcing Antony into a cold, loveless political marriage with a traditional Roman woman named Octavia. For 3 long years, Antony played the part perfectly. He lived in a grand Roman house with thick walls and cold marble floors, attending boring Senate meetings and giving hollow speeches about duty and honor beneath the surface. However, he was entirely miserable. His new bed felt incredibly cold, and he often lay awake staring at the ceiling late at night while his new wife slept beside him. Feeling absolutely nothing for her, his mind was completely consumed by memories of Egypt, remembering the heavy smell of jasmine on the river, the intense heat of Cleopatra's skin, and the sound of her laugh in the dark streets. He physically ached for her. Feeling completely empty inside, he realized that the strict rules of Rome were a suffocating cage, and that living as a ghost in his own home was no longer worth it. He had to escape. Chapter 6: The Freezing Snow. Antony finally found an excuse to leave Rome by demanding a new military command in the Middle East, marching his troops into the mountains of Parthia to manage a brutal war. The campaign turned into a total disaster from the very first day, caught in the freezing snow as winter storms arrived early. His army suffered as the wind howled through the mountain passes and the supply lines completely collapsed. After the wagons broke down in the deep snowdrifts, and the enemy attacked them relentlessly from the high ridges, Antony was forced to order a humiliating retreat back toward the coast. The journey was a living nightmare for his starving soldiers, who were forced to eat their dying horses and chew on leather straps just to survive. As their fingers and toes went numb in the freezing mountain wind, men simply fell into the snow and went to sleep, never to wake up. Walking at the front of the line, Antony was a broken, defeated man who watched his men die while the freezing wind cut right through his wool cloak. Having lost the war and his invincible reputation, he knew the Roman public would view him as an absolute failure. He only survived the miserable march by closing his eyes to block out the screaming wind and focusing on the memory of her warm breath on his neck, using the phantom heat of her body to keep his own heart beating in the blinding snow. He put one foot in front of the other, refusing to die in the cold, simply because he wanted to see her one last time. Chapter 7: The Rescue on the Beach. When Antony finally reached the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, he stood on a cold, rocky beach with the starving, ragged remnants of his army. As a disgraced general with no money to pay his troops and no supplies to feed them, he expected a Roman fleet to arrive and arrest him. Assuming he had been totally abandoned by everyone, looking out at the grey water, a familiar ship with beautiful purple sails suddenly sailed into view over the horizon. Cleopatra had arrived. Standing on the deck of her ship, she saw him on the rocky beach, covered in dirt, blood, and defeat with a hollow face and dented armor. In that moment, she realized she did not care about him as a political Roman weapon anymore. She simply loved the man. Rushing off her ship and running across the wet stones, she went straight to him on the cold beach and pulled him tightly against her body, completely ignoring the dirt. Taking his freezing hands and pressing them firmly against her warm cheeks, she gave him a physical relief that washed over him and nearly made his knees buckle. After wrapping him in thick cloaks, she signaled her crews to unload ships full of winter clothes, hot food, and gold to pay his dying men. Leading him onto her ship and closing the heavy wooden door of the quiet cabin against the cold wind, she held him close, slowly bringing the heat back into his frozen bones and choosing him at his absolute lowest moment. Close your eyes, take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to Z in History. Chapter 9: The Forbidden Will. Back in Rome, Octavian was furious when he received the reports from Alexandria. Seeing a golden opportunity to use the romance as a deadly political weapon to destroy Antony once and for all, marching through the streets of Rome with armed guards, Octavian broke into a sacred temple belonging to the Vestal Virgins, which served as the most secure vault in the city. Targeting the specific room where Antony's deeply private will was kept, he physically threatened the priestesses and stole the personal document, marching directly into the packed, angry Roman Senate. Octavian stood at the podium, broke the seal on the stolen document, and read it out loud to the entire government. The words were absolutely scandalous to the strict Romans, as the will spoke of Antony's desperate desire to be buried in Egypt beside Cleopatra forever, by demanding that their physical bond lasts for eternity. He was completely rejecting the sacred burial grounds of Rome and his own ancestors. Disgusted by his absolute devotion to a foreign woman, the Senate viewed him as a traitor and officially declared war on their romance. However, they did not declare war on Antony directly. They declared war on Cleopatra, forcing Antony into a terrible position where he had to draw his sword against his own brothers to protect his lover. Chapter 10: The Last Quiet Night. Moving their combined army to Greece, Antony and Cleopatra set up camp on the rocky coast and waited for the Roman forces to arrive. The camp outside was miserable, with constant rain turning the ground into deep, thick mud that spread sickness through the tents, causing the soldiers to cough and shiver. When Antony's veteran generals approached him, they begged him to fight the war on solid ground, where the Roman heavy infantry was unbeatable. However, Cleopatra wanted to fight a naval battle on the water to protect her own Egyptian ships. After listening to his men, Antony looked at his wife, trusted her completely, and actively ignored his experienced generals by choosing to fight on the water inside their royal tent. Tucked away from the mud and the fear, the heavy canvas blocked the wind and kept them warm. Knowing a massive, deadly battle against the Roman fleet was coming in the morning, they understood this might be the absolute end of their lives. Holding each other fiercely in the candlelight, they spent their final quiet hours completely wrapped in each other's arms, choosing this fleeting physical connection over their fear of tomorrow, making love in the dark shadow of the coming war. They savored every single second of their intense chemistry, memorizing the feeling of each other's skin with the silent promise that if they were going to die, they would die together. Chapter 11. Choosing her over Rome. As the sun rose over the ocean and light hit the water, the Battle of Actium officially began. Hundreds of wooden ships crashed together off the coast, the sound of splintering wood echoing across the waves. The battle was incredibly chaotic. As the smaller, faster enemy ships darted between the massive Egyptian vessels, allowing the Roman forces to trap Antony's fleet against the coastline. With flaming arrows raining down from the sky, fire broke out on the wooden decks, sending thick, black smoke into the air as men screamed and fell into the sea, watching the destruction from her massive flagship while the smoke stung her eyes. Cleopatra realized the fight was completely lost as the Roman trap slowly closed. Making a desperate choice, her ship broke through a small gap in the enemy line, turning her purple sails to the wind as she fled the burning battle. Standing on the deck of his own ship, surrounded by smoke and screaming men, Antony swung his heavy iron sword until he looked through the haze and saw her purple sails leaving the fight. Looking at his burning ships and his strict Roman honor, a sudden realization hit him that none of this, the politics, the wars, the rules of Rome, was ever real. The only real thing in his life was her. Dropping his sword so it clattered against the wooden deck, he abandoned his loyal men, jumped into a small rowboat, and rowed desperately through the smoke after her fleeing ship because he only wanted to be back in her arms. Chapter 12. The Peace of the Cabin. Reaching her ship at last, Antony climbed over the wooden rail and collapsed onto the deck. Although they had managed to escape the burning fleet, the war was completely lost, meaning he had thrown away his honor, abandoned his army, and lost his entire empire. Rushing to him, Cleopatra pulled him into the dark, quiet cabin of the ship and closed the heavy wooden door to block out the sounds of the ocean. She did not speak, nor did she judge him for running away. Instead, a profound sense of peace washed over her. Even though they had lost their empires, her treasury was gone, and his reputation was ruined. She finally had him entirely to herself, completely free from the crushing weight of politics. Wrapping her arms around his exhausted shoulders, she pulled his head down to rest gently against her chest. Closing his eyes, he felt the steady, calming beat of her heart against his cheek and breathed in the familiar scent of jasmine. While the world outside was burning and the massive Roman army would soon hunt them down, the terrifying noise of war finally faded away in her warm embrace. Feeling the softness of her skin under his rough hands, he realized his final goal was achieved. Free from the strict rules of Rome and no longer having to pretend he was right where he belonged, finally at peace.